Welcome back to Play the Game HQ. I'm Daniel, and in this video we're going to teach you how to play In the Footsteps of Marie Curie, created by Sorry We're French and brought to you by Hachette Board Games USA, who helped sponsor this video. In the Footsteps of Marie Curie puts you in the role of young researchers working alongside the famous scientist as you conduct experiments, upgrade your lab, write theses, and win the Nobel Prize. The game is played over a series of rounds as you move through the timeline of Marie Curie's life, beginning with her birth in 1867 and ending with her death in 1934. While the game only uses the timeline to track progress and trigger events, the appendix includes information about each step along the timeline that will help you learn more about some of the significant events in Marie Curie's life, as well as basic education on radioactivity. And the back of the appendix and the last few pages of the rulebook have references that explain all of the timeline effects and how to resolve the different cards and experiment tiles. To set up the game, put the main board in the middle of the table with the timeline marker on 1867, then assemble the cube tower and put it next to the board, and put the cubes into a supply away from the cube tower so that they don't get mixed up with the cubes coming out of the chute at the bottom of the tower. Shuffle the activity cards and put them in a face-down deck next to the top left of the board, then reveal 4 cards to fill the spaces in the card track. Sort the experiment tiles by type and stack each type with the experiment side face down on the matching spaces on the top right corner of the board. Sort the thesis tiles by level 1 through 4 and put them in their matching spaces on the top of the board. Then pick the workshop tile that matches your player count and put it in the top center space of the board with side 1 facing up and the gold ring workshop marker over the starting space. Put the Marie Curie tile next to the board and create a supply of victory point tokens. Then give each player a player board and a random objective tile, and you'll put your objective tile face up on the objective tile space of your player board. And then give the player who last conducted an experiment the first player token, and you're ready to get started. Starting with the first player and moving clockwise around the table, players will take turns until the timeline marker reaches the final space of the timeline. The timeline along the bottom of the board represents some of the major milestones of Marie Curie's life, and each space shows the date and the effect of the space. The timeline marker will advance anytime a timeline icon is triggered, for instance when these cards are resolved or when the workshop token gets to this space of the workshop tile. As soon as the timeline marker moves, all players immediately apply the effect if they are able to and want to, starting with the player who triggered it and going clockwise around the table, although taking the timeline effect is always optional. Anytime you earn victory points during your turn, take tokens from the supply and store them on the top of your player board. On your player board, you have your personal laboratory. This is where you'll store your thesis tiles and complete experiments to expand your resource capacity, as well as store resources, activity cards, and more. You also have a reference at the bottom of the board to remind you of the resource transformations you can take on your turn. The Marie Curie token starts next to the board, but players can take that token through different effects throughout the game. When you see this icon, take the Marie Curie token either from its space next to the board or from the player currently holding it and put it next to your player board. This will give you a bonus resource transformation you can make on your turn and an extra point if you have that token at the end of the game. On your turn, you're going to take 4 steps in order, and then it's the next player's turn. These steps are shown at the top of the main board. First is the workshop, then research, followed by experimentation, and finally rest. There's 3 resources you'll be using throughout the game. Black is pitchblende, gold is uranium, and silver is radium. In the workshop phase, you'll start your turn by taking the cubes shown on the current position of the workshop marker and dropping them into the cube tower. So in this case, that's 4 pitchblende. Now you'll notice I dropped 4 cubes in and only 2 came out. The tower is designed so that not all of the cubes fall through every time, and sometimes you'll knock cubes loose that were dropped on an earlier turn because we're doing science, and science can be unpredictable at times. If there's no more cubes in the supply or there's not enough cubes to drop all of the cubes shown, just drop what's available. Once you've dropped your cubes in the tower, it's time to research. During the research phase, you have 2 options. You can collect resources or you can write a thesis. The 2 experiment columns on your player board show how many resources you can collect and how many you can store. But storage limits only matter at the end of your turn, so you can exceed them during your turn as long as you discard down to your limits at the end of your turn. At the beginning of the game, each player can collect and store 3 resources, but you can increase those limits by performing experiments. If you decide to collect resources during the research phase, take any of the cubes that have fallen out of the tower up to your limit, which again at the start of the game is 3, and put them on your Erlenmeyer flask for storage. If you don't want to take resources, you can choose to write a thesis instead, and you do this by taking a thesis from the main board. You have to take them in order, so the first time you'll take a thesis 1, then a 2, then a 3, all the way up to 4, and you can only write 1 of each type during the game. When you take a thesis, you're going to flip it over and take the bonus shown on the back, and then put it in the designated spot on your player board. So taking this thesis would give me one of these two experiments. I get to choose which kind I want to take, and then I'll place it on my player board. So I'm going to take a round bottom flask and put it on my player board. Next is the experimentation phase. There's 4 actions you can do during the experimentation phase, and they're all optional, and you can do them in any order that you choose. You can purchase an activity card, you can transform resources, you can validate experiments, and you can validate your objective. You can purchase one activity card shown by paying the cost on the top left corner of the card. There's 5 types of cards, and the category is shown on the top right corner of the card, and those correspond to the 5 spaces at the bottom of your player board. So I can purchase this card by playing 1 uranium. When you purchase an activity card, you'll tuck it under your player board in the matching space, and then take a bonus based on how many cards you have tucked in that space, including the one you just added. So this is my first card, which means I get a pitch blend, and I'm going to move the time marker. And when I move it up, I immediately get to take the bonus, which is another pitch blend, which I'll put on my Erlenmeyer flask. If I were to add a second card of the same type on a future turn, I would take 1 radium. And the highest bonus shown is also the maximum number of that type of card that you can have tucked under your board. And page 10 of the rule book explains all of the bonus for each type of activity card. To transform resources, you'll use the resources from your supply and make any number of the transformations shown at the bottom of your board. You can transform 2 pitch blend into 1 uranium into 1 radium, and 2 radium plus 1 uranium into 1 victory point. If you have the Marie Curie tile, you can make an exchange of 2 radium for a victory point without needing the 1 uranium. Now, reverse transformations are not allowed, so don't transform things just because you can. Make sure you have a use for what you're making. And that takes us to experiments. During the game, you'll be collecting experiments anytime you trigger this icon. This allows you to take one of these experiments from the supply, you get to choose which kind, and add it to your player board. And then you can validate those experiments during the experimentation phase of your turn. When you take an experiment, place it in the top available spot on the matching column on your player board with the experiment side up. During the experimentation phase, you can validate any number of experiments in any order you choose by paying the cost shown and then taking the reward shown. And you can use the rewards from one experiment to validate another experiment on the same turn. So for this experiment, I need to turn in 2 uranium and get 2 pitch blend. So I'll turn in 2 uranium and I'll get 2 pitch blend. Once you validate an experiment, flip the tile over. Each beaker you complete will increase the number of resources you can take at the beginning of your turn by 1, and each round bottom flask experiment you complete will increase your resource storage by 1. And both of those max out at 6 total, 3 at the start of the game and 1 for each experiment validated. Each time you complete a set of adjacent experiments, you also take a victory point, and there's a reminder of this in between the experiments on your player board. And finally, you have the option to validate your objective tile if you can. Each player starts out with 1 objective tile. Once you meet the conditions, which for mine is to take 5 experiments, take the reward shown and then flip the tile over. Once you've performed all of your actions, discard resources down to your storage limit, which in my case is 4. It's 3 for my base and 1 for this experiment that I completed, so I need to discard 1 to get down to 4. Then move the workshop marker to the next space on the workshop tile, and it's the next player's turn. When the workshop marker moves to the bottom center space on the workshop tile, flip the whole workshop tile over and place the marker on the bottom left space of the track. And it's very likely that the workshop tile will move back and forth between sides 1 and 2 a few times during the game. The end of the game is triggered when the timeline marker reaches the final space on the timeline. When this happens, complete the current round so that all players have an equal number of turns, then everyone counts their victory points. Whoever has the Marie Curie token at the end of the game gets 1 extra victory point, and the player with the highest score at the end of the game wins. If there's a tie, the player with the most radium wins, followed by uranium, then pitch blend. And if there's still a tie, then players just have to share the victory. And that's In the Footsteps of Marie Curie. If you have any questions at all, be sure to leave us a comment below and we'll answer as quick as we can. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you later. Bye.